Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour. It's our regular economics panel with our regular guests, Gemma Tetlow from the Institute for Government, Ben Chew from the BBC, and our own Jill Rutter and Sarah Hall. We're obviously meeting in the light of the autumn statement, which is what we'll focus on. But if there are other questions about the state of the economy more broadly you'd like me to post to the panelists, stick your questions in Slido. As ever, before I lose my voice, vote for the questions you'd like me to post to the panel, and hopefully we can get a lot in over the next hour. So by way of a starter for 10 for all four of you, this is a really easy starter for 10. What are your main takeaways from the autumn statement in any order you wish to go in?
I don't mind going first.
Yes. Well volunteered.
Always the easiest job. I think I had two takeaways. Firstly, looking narrowly at the tax measures that were announced, they seemed well designed to boost economic growth and employment and to remove some distortions and inefficiencies in the tax system. So looking at them narrowly as a package of tax measures, they were reasonably well designed. But zooming out from that, the broader picture of what had happened to the forecasts and the outlook that we already had for public spending left me feeling that it wasn't a situation in which I would have gone for tax cuts, because essentially those were paid for by taking a windfall from high inflation and using it to cut taxes, but not in any way topping up public spending plans, which were already looking tight and are now even more squeezed by that higher inflation.
Brill, thank you. Who wants to go next?
Shall I go, Anand?
You go. Yep.
Yeah, my impression is that this was my top takeaway was that this is an autumn statement which was changed course, I think, quite late in the day. Because if you remember, Jeremy Hunt only a few weeks ago was sort of saying now is not the time for tax cuts, we can't afford them. And then we get a huge tax cutting budget. So I think quite a lot has changed in recent weeks. And I think what has changed is a sense that you know, the original plan A wasn't working, maybe a sense of desperation, you might want to put it like that, about the political positioning of the party and ahead of the next election, that they needed to, if they wanted to keep their powder dry and do tax cuts next year, that was going to be too late. So I think at the last minute, relatively speaking, they've made a decision that they can't afford to wait and they need to go for tax cuts, because as we'll talk about, no doubt, this was a worse economic outlook than in March. Higher inflation, growth downgrades. This wasn't there wasn't any genuine windfall to speak of in terms of the economic outlook, and yet they still did these tax cuts. So my sense is that yes, it was all quite last minute, and they made some quite big decisions relatively late in the day.
So a couple of things from me. I mean, first of all, you know, Ben clearly didn't listen to Jeremy Hunt's speech, because the economy has turned a corner, and it's not turned a corner down into a sort of, you know, depressing cul-de-sac. You know, everything is going much better, or at least that's what he wanted us to say. And I think it's quite interesting just the boldness with which he managed to make those assertions in the light of the sort of rather depressing analysis about, you know, declining long-run productivity. Inflation's now gone from being an external shock into being much more domestically generated and therefore much more intractable, and things like that. So I thought that was that. And also deeply depressing stuff on living standards. The bit that really I thought was interesting was before the autumn statement, the IFS were warning that, you know, whenever you give a chancellor a bit of fiscal headroom in the autumn, the chancellor always gobbles it all up, potentially to regret at leisure when they reverse the numbers, as they may very well do, because it's an incredibly precarious position he's put himself in terms of fiscal headroom. And Gemma and I were speculating yesterday about whether Jeremy Hunt really wanted to deliver a budget in the spring, whether he might be tempted to find some way of doing it. They're actually briefing they might want to go early, because, you know, there are quite big downside risks that could wipe out the sort of headroom margin that he's left himself. I mean, he faces some quite difficult decisions, even before you take account of the fact that absolutely no one on this planet, including the OBR, including the Treasury Select Committee, thinks he's going to go ahead with restoring the fuel duty cut and indexing it, which is already in the numbers, and nobody thinks the public spending numbers are sustainable in the longer term. And he gaily announced that public sector productivity was going to rise by 0.5%, but did absolutely nothing to say why should we believe that public sector productivity was suddenly going to rise by 0.5%. So it really did look, as Ben was saying, a bit like a sort of, desperate political throw of the dice, and just another reminder of why it would be much better if we only had one budget a year, so we didn't have this seesawing, which the IFS pointed out because of the asymmetry of responses to fiscal headroom. You use it all up when you've got it. You basically take it on the chin, more or less, when you don't, and when the numbers go in the wrong direction, ends up rising debt. So I think it's a very good reminder of why the IFS, Institute for Government, and the Chartered Institute of Taxation were right, and Philip Hammond were right to say one fiscal event a year, even if Ed Balls and George Osborne thinks that's just to give Treasury officials a quiet life.
Yeah, I just want to probe you on this, Jill. I mean, does having only one irresponsible fiscal event a year really make that much difference from having? I mean, in a sense, the issue is short-termism and politics, isn't it, rather than the number of these events we have? I mean, is there a...
Well, we're a real outlier in doing, having this sort of double dipping. This puts the UK, and it's one reason why IMF, OECD, and people say, the UK shouldn't do this. But I think there's the sort of desperation to find measures to fill the space.
Yeah.
He could have announced, we could have had an announcement about, could have come from Kemi Badenoch as business secretary. She could have announced lots of measures to support industry and the growth of the economy. It doesn't have to be in a budget. So you get to sort of scrabble for measures. And I think the interesting thing that I hadn't really appreciated since until the IFS did that analysis was actually, so it was mainly about just the scrabbles for loads and loads of measures that I objected to, and the fact it would be much easier to do that once a year, and that would reduce the temptation to fill the space and fill the column inches. But I think now actually this sort of headroom in a volatile environment, this headroom issue actually ending up with us having higher debt because of the way in which chancellors feel the need to react. Someone said to me on Twitter when I was talking about a single fiscal event, well, the chancellor couldn't have all this headroom and not react. You can't do that, sort of whatever. There's a giant packet of marshmallows on the table in terms of headroom. You've got to dive right in. You're not going to say, well, that's very interesting. Let's hope those marshmallows are still there in March, and then I will make a strategic decision when the numbers are clearer, or indeed do it all in November and not bother with March. So, that does seem to actually have a positive, perverse effect at the macro level, not just the sort of micro temptation to fiddle all the time with what quite often are quite a lot of half-baked measures. I mean, the good news for Jeremy Hunt, though, is it's Friday, and he hasn't yet had a substantial budget measure unravel. So by the standards of many budgets and autumn statements, that's quite an achievement.
Right. Sarah, do you want to come in with your thoughts?
Yeah, it's obviously it's hard coming last. I mean, I agree. I think, he had some wiggle room, and what he chose to do with that is quite telling in terms of moving on tax cuts rather than potentially investing in public services, which I think are one of the areas that the autumn statement doesn't touch on as significantly as it might. I think the other main takeaway I had from it was that the hunt for growth in the UK economy continues. And I think this was really clearly evidenced by the fact that I think over 50 documents were released alongside the autumn statement, covering a whole host of areas, devolution, AI, issues around regulation. I think that just shows how persistent the UK's low growth status is proving to be, and how hard it is currently proving to be to find areas that are stimulating growth.
Just for our audience, I don't want to sound churlish and say that I don't appreciate the one question we have, which reads, "That's a great jumper, Anand." But if anyone has anything more substantive, thank you very much, Anonymous, much appreciated. But if you have more substantive questions, do put them in the Slido and I will pose them to the panel. I suppose first question, based on what you've said, I mean, we've had this national insurance cut. Will people really feel it? I mean, I get the sense from Torsten and the Resolution Foundation today that their argument is, in the greater scheme of things, no, because things are so rubbish for most people. Will people sort of in January really notice this, or is this going to get swept away in the greater sort of cost of living crisis?
Well, I'm going to come in with a trivial point here that was being made by the money saving expert on Newscast on the BBC. Sorry, Ben, I was probably listening when I should have been listening to Newsnight. But he said that actually he thought one of the reasons why they decided to go in January was because that was actually a time when people would notice it, because you weren't getting a sort of, updated pay increase, you weren't getting other changes to your tax code. So actually he thought it would sort of stand out because not much else would be happening in your pay packet in January. It does also coincide with, we heard Ofgem yesterday announce the rise of 5% in the energy price cap, and people will be paying more for that. So he thought that was a way of making it standing out. But I mean, I think one of the big difficulties for the Chancellor in all of this is, that a lot of his argument about feeling better off is that you're feeling better off compared to a future that you hadn't experienced. And that's quite difficult. It's, you can see it in the numbers where you were going to have sort of, fiscal drag effects coming through. But what do you do? But in cash, you will see a slight change, unless, of course, you're a pensioner, someone who's working but over state pensionable age or whatever, or just pay tax on your savings or dividends, in which case you don't see it, which is actually one of the big pluses of doing national insurance rather than doing income tax.
I think Jill raises an interesting point about the paychecks, because it'd be interesting to see to what extent people are actually monitoring their paychecks today in the way that they did in the past, because obviously a lot of companies have gone digital. And I know certainly I look at them a lot less, because you have to click a few times, whereas you used to get a little slip of paper, you might look at it more. So whether that will affect how people feel about the next cut or not is an interesting, and I suspect an open question. But of course, the context here is, when people are, what time frame are people thinking about in terms of being better off? Is it 1 month relative to what it would have been that previous month, or is it over the entire Parliament, when we were set to have the biggest drop in real disposable income per person according to the OBR's forecasts? Is that the more the time frame that people think about in terms of, am I better or worse off? I suspect it's probably the latter, and we've seen all the charts and data this week to show you why we're still on course for that, but we'll see.
I mean, we've got before you come in, Gemma, just to say there's a follow-up that you might want to incorporate, which is, you've got the national insurance cut, but you've also got this enormous fiscal drag effect. And, I suppose the question is, will the latter completely overshadow the former for a lot of people?
I suspect in terms of how people actually feel, I think there's quite a lot of evidence that people suffer from money illusion. So whilst we, as economists, talk about fiscal drag and the freezing of thresholds making people worse off than they would have been relative to a world where we didn't freeze those thresholds, I think most people, the fiscal drag doesn't mean that they're losing any money. Their income stays the same. They get the same post-tax income. They just don't get the increase they would have got had thresholds been indexed. So yeah. I think money illusion means that people will notice the NIC's cut more than they notice what they're losing from the freezing of the thresholds. On the timing of it, I defer to the money saving expert on knowing when people get pay rises, but I thought a similar number of companies had calendar year financial years, and therefore probably quite a lot of people do get pay rises in January at the same time as the NIC's rise. But more broadly, I'd agree with Ben's take that I think the outlook for household disposable incomes is basically falling this year and sort of weak recovery over the next few years, so that the OBR numbers certainly suggest that going into the next election, household disposable incomes are going to be below where they were going into the 2019 election. I think taking all that together, I'm not sure people are going to feel hugely better off. And as Jill said, really the economy has turned a corner and they're suddenly feeling much better. Inflation is still high, even if only half as high as it was this time last year.
I mean, I don't know what the IFG or BBC do, but at King's they have this wacky idea of giving you your December salary before Christmas. So actually the January pay packet is the one I really, really, really look forward to, because it's been so bloody long since the last one. So if there is one I notice, it's that one. But anyway, Sarah, do you want to come in, not on my pay packet, but on the other question about whether people might actually notice this?
I mean, I think they will, and I agree with Gemma in terms of, you know, as economists, people talk about things like fiscal drag, and I think, you know, that's quite remote from kind of managing household finances, and I think that's why, if the decision had been made to make tax cuts economically and politically, there are quite strong reasons why doing it through NICs makes more sense than doing it through income tax. I think the other thing that I was really struck by in the OBR document that accompanied the autumn statement was the extent to which interest rate rises had been passed through to households already. And I think it's still around half of that hasn't come through in terms of things like mortgage rates. I think that's a little bit underreported in terms of the strains that some households may start to feel or increasingly feel as we go through 2024. I think so far that the sort of general analysis has pointed to households finding the change interest rate environment hard but not completely unmanageable. If that gets harder, what happens next, I think, is quite a kind of crucial economic context at the household level.
Okay, well, next question, I suppose, is just imagine in a hypothetical world that I don't understand anything at all about economics. Can someone talk me through the relative benefits of a tax cut via NICs versus income tax, and, you know, why one it might be better than the other, or what the difference is?
I'm happy to have a bash at that, and then
Yes,
people can improve on my answer. So the big difference between NICs and income tax is the types of income that applies to. In particular, income tax is charged on all forms of income, both earned and unearned. So it applies to pension income, investment income, whereas NICs only applies to earnings, and crucially only earnings of people under the state pension age. So when you do a NICs cut, you target that tax cut more directly on the earned income of people below the state pension age, rather than an income tax cut, which is a benefit to anyone receiving any type of income, including older workers and people getting income from pensions and dividends. So what that means is that for a given amount of money that you're giving away in a tax cut, the NICs cut is more directly focused on creating a greater incentive for people of below state pension age to increase their hours of work. I mean, it's worth saying that actually there are two offsetting effects for working age people in a NICs cut. One is that by cutting their tax for a given amount of work, they take home more, and that might actually encourage them to work fewer hours. But the offsetting effect is that for the marginal extra hour that you work, you get more benefit from that, and that encourages them to work more. And the OBR judgment, looking at the economic evidence base, was that they thought overall that would tend to encourage more people to enter work and work longer hours. So estimating about 94,000 full-time equivalent increase in employment.
I mean, I think the other thing from the Chancellor's point of view is NICs are a weekly tax rather than an annual tax. You couldn't have changed income tax in January. You'd have to wait to the start of the new financial year, because you have applied on all your income whenever you earn it during the year. Even though for most people it looks pretty weekly or monthly, because most of what they pay is PAYE. So that's a logistical difference in doing NICs, which has enabled him to bring that tax cut forward. The other thing I think is interesting to set it alongside, as Gemma said, we'd heard in the run-up to the autumn statement this debate about the indexation of pensions and how much pensions were going to be indexed by. Were they going to go with the full 8.5% implied by the triple lock on a definition of earnings that included bonuses, or were the Treasury going to do some sleight of hand which would say, well, you know, bonuses don't count this year and you're going to get a slightly lower uprating. And so by, if you like, denying for better off pensioners who are tax-paying pensioners a benefit from the tax cut, you could say that there's a slight clawback for going with the 8.5% indexation rather than the 7 point whatever it would have been if they'd gone for the bonus-free figure. But
okay, brilliant.
Just also might be worth pointing out, Anand, that this breaks a long chain of NICs going up, the NICs rate going up while income tax has been coming down, which has really exacerbated all those issues that Gemma has been talking about. Although if, as many predict, income tax also rate comes down in the March budget, then that'll undo a little bit of that differential as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that, you know, within the Treasury, there is a sort of general view that if you have to put up a direct tax, you know, and Politico earlier in the week said he might do something on NICs or he might do something on direct taxation, and then talked about income tax, which I was wincing at. But if you have to do something on tax on incomes, that usually if you need to put something up, NICs are easier to get away with, and we've seen that before. And we saw that in the form of that slightly tortuous health and social care levy that made a brief outing before being bopped on the head by quasi-Kwarteng, which is a sort of NICs plus a dividends levy. And that you get credit for cutting income tax because they can blast big rate cuts on that. And so politically, it was quite an interesting strategy. I think it's also quite interesting, you know, based on what Ben was saying, because there's a sort of, you know, implicit view. If you've got that amount of money which has been generated by failure to index tax thresholds, if you thought that in 2021 or whatever we had 2020, we had the right level of income tax thresholds in real terms, you might have decided that now you didn't need to raise so much through fiscal drag, that you might have said, well, actually, I don't need to keep that sort of under indexation or freezing in place for so long. I can raise them, you know, maybe not by full indexation, but by a bit less. So I thought it was quite interesting because that has been a very long run strategy to focus on thresholds rather than rates. So it's really interesting to see that that coming back.
One, just to add to the point Jill was making there about the easier political sell of raising national insurance than income tax, because people somehow think it pays for things that they like the NHS and state pensions. It's quite interesting that this perhaps seems to work asymmetrically. So when you're going for tax increases, it's easier to make that argument for a NICs rise rather than income tax rise. But when they cut NICs this week, I didn't see anyone coming out saying, gosh, we're now going to have less money for the NHS and pensions. This is a terrible thing. So it's interesting asymmetry in the political economy around that.
Even though it's true, because he's paid for it by the squeeze on public services, as Sarah was saying. So, and the OBR makes pretty clear that there's almost a direct mirror transfer of what you'd have had to do to restore the, you know, real value of spending on public services back to the levels in March with the amount that he gave away in tax cuts.
I mean, this might be a really unfair question because I suppose it's a polling question. That trade-off's interesting, isn't it? The degree to which people equate fiscal changes like the NICs cut with the state of public services strikes me as quite important. I don't know if any of you have any, I don't know if you picked anything up in your work, Ben, but to what extent people sort of stuck in NHS waiting lists associate that with these fiscal measures, or whether in the minds of the public they're kept completely separate and they don't make that causal link. Strikes me as quite an important political question this year.
It is, but if you look at that long-run polling, Anand, about whether it's time to tax and spend more, whether it's time to keep them the same, or whether to cut them, for quite a long time, people have been saying it's time to tax more and spend more, and that has correlated with the state of the public services post 2010. So I think that's a bit of evidence on a very general level that people realise that you can't get away with cutting taxes and expecting decent or improving public services.
Okay, yeah, that's very sensible. We also had announcements at the same time, of course, about the living wage and about benefit levels. I mean, what do we make of those? I think I was pleasantly surprised, but I'm willing to be told that I've got that wrong.
Well, I was just going to talk about the pitch rolling on those, well, particularly the benefit changes. they did an awful lot of leaking and briefing in advance of the autumn statement that they might be considering raising benefits and pensions by less than the standard indexation amount. And then made a lot in the speech of, oh, we've received representations that we shouldn't do this, but we're going to go ahead with default indexation. So it was clever political theatre to get credit for what was essentially just normal policy response. So I mean, I guess perhaps there was a genuine part of that. They were considering not being so generous to welfare recipients, and then they decided that on balance it was appropriate to stick to the normal indexation rules. But moving away from that would have been a decision not to keep pace with inflation with those benefit payments, which would have been a further hit to the incomes of low-income people at a time when prices have been going up quite significantly.
I mean, just a personal plea, if we can avoid at all costs setting Jill off on a hobby horse of the Chancellor being interviewed before the autumn statement, that would be...
But I'm right, Anand, I'm right. Just admit it would be much more interesting.
Oh God, I've done it.
I know he does the things, but the Sunday interviews are just a waste of space.
Just a point, Anand, on that timing issue, it is quite interesting that the OBR in its the document said that we got the final tax and spending decisions from the Treasury on the Thursday before last Thursday, which means there was a lot of speculation about, inheritance tax being cut and benefits being cut at the same time, which was allowed to run, even though actually they'd made the decision that they were not going to shift either of those two taxes, according to what the OBR confirmed. So I think there was a lot, as Gemma said, a lot of political theatre in that. Maybe they wanted to send a signal that this is the sort of thing that the Conservative government might want to do in future, i.e. cut benefits, cut inheritance tax, even they weren't going to do it this time. And they get headlines that transmit that message in a way that suits them, or in a way that they feel suits them, even if they don't want to do it quite now.
Yeah, and this felt very, very political. We'll get back onto the politics of this towards the end. I mean, this did feel political, and of course we've got this debate raging now about whether it makes a May election more likely or not. The other side of the coin with the autumn statement, of course, was the stuff to do with growth, the expensing for businesses and things like that. Who wants to do my idiot's guide to that?
I can maybe make a start, Anand. So I think there were some announcements in the statement which would be seen as being helpful to businesses. So making permanent expensing to try and encourage firms to invest in capital, and that the research base suggests that that's an area that the UK has been particularly weak on compared to its European counterparts. Germany is usually used as an example there. But I think the issue around growth is a bit bigger than that, sort of a quite specific point. And if you think what you might need to encourage growth as an economy, most economists and economic geographers like myself would probably say you need a stable and certain trade regime and a stable and certain regulatory regime. That those are two elements that really help, and they're two areas that the UK is still struggling with and grappling with. So just on the case of regulation, for example, one of the areas that the Sunak government has clearly identified as a potential source of growth is around AI. It was seen very clearly in his autumn AI summit. It's there very clearly in some of the accompanying documents. But this is also an area where the UK is having to develop its regulatory capacity and capability outside of Europe. It's made a lot of the ability of the UK to regulate nimbly, flexibly, tailor it to the needs of the UK economy. But there's some evidence that the UK is possibly a little bit slower in regulating than it might want to be. And there's also questions about the sort of direction of travel of the regulators and their relationship to government. So just today, we saw a steer being issued by the government to the Competition and Markets Authority, and encouraging it to focus on growth in its decision-making. And this is related to the time it took the UK to authorise Microsoft's acquisition of a gaming company, slower than other companies. I think the issue here is that historically, one of the strengths of UK regulation that supported growth in key areas like financial services has been kind of independent regulators with a really clear set of signals around what the priorities were, the direction of travel that can encourage investment into the economy. I think uncertainty, or some uncertainty around the direction of travel that UK regulators might be taking and the extent to which the government might be intervening, or at least giving steers as to what they should be prioritising, pose some challenges to that area of growth at least.
Anyone else on the growth measures in this, and how convincing you found them? Whether they're a blueprint for more than sclerotic growth?
I think the general consensus would be that there were some decent stuff in there on expensing. Something, there's a decent body of evidence that suggests that it will do some good. And Gemma mentioned the national insurance stuff. I think the OBR hasn't factored any of that in, but I think it's slightly unfair for them to expect them to do that, given that their time frame is relatively limited. And there were some hints, and pretty more than hints actually, in the document, saying that we think this will be good for growth in various respects in the longer term, even though it doesn't have a transformative effect over the policy horizon. And actually, they've revised down their potential GDP growth forecast for the UK from 1.8% to 1.6% over the horizon. So nothing good there, but I think it was a thumbs up as far as the OBR can give a thumbs up. But there was a thumbs down also, I think, from the OBR quite explicitly on the cuts to public capital expenditure, state spending on infrastructure relative to the last document, which was also a cut relative to the previous financial statement. So the government is sort of cheese paring away increases in capital expenditure, which were to take it up to the sort of highest sustained levels, since in many, many decades, which was generally perceived by analysts and economists to be a good thing and something that we needed to do, having underinvested for a long time. So the government had a positive story to say on business investment overall, but they didn't really try and defend at all the fact that they were cutting away at state and infrastructure spending. And I think that will, as the OBR said in its document, we will feel the effects of that in terms of a lower public capital stock for a long time, and that will have a negative offsetting impact on our GDP growth potential over the longer term, unless it changes.
And also,
but I'm sorry, Anand, I was saying that partly plays into what's emerging as one of the sort of critiques, because obviously Rachel Reeves has said she signs up to the suite of growth measures, signs up to the NIC cuts, but the stick with which Jeremy Hunt is beating Labour is on that commitment to invest more in capital, in that reaching 28 billion by the end of the Parliament. Hunt still says she's promising 28 billion a year, which she isn't anymore, but how that's just going to all lead to more debt, more interest costs, worsening borrowing and things like that. And, in a sense, one of the things people were doing was netting that off against what the government was doing. So maybe that makes the net figure a bit bigger because the government's reining that back. But that does seem to be a sort of emerging gap there on state investment spending.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but if at the same time the Chancellor is promising higher productivity from the public sector, it strikes me that in sectors like health, investment in capital is precisely what you need to get that productivity going. One of the reasons why we have a productivity problem in the NHS is a lack of kit. It's falling down buildings, obviously, partly, but it's also, the lack of scanners and things like that. So that doesn't really add up, does it?
Certainly, the analysis that colleagues at the Institute of Government have done in our annual performance tracker, looking at different public services, does suggest exactly that concern. So Jeremy Hunt put a lot of store this week in the opportunity for improving public service productivity to sort of square the circle of what we and others are pointing to as what look like implausibly low spending plans for the next few years, by saying if we can improve productivity, we can get more for less. But there are lots of places where, exactly as you say, probably improving productivity is going to require better capital equipment. So for example, there are cases of hospitals having wards with ceilings falling down or sewage pumping out onto the outpatient department, which mean that staff can't work effectively because they don't have the room to do it, or school buildings, obviously, with rack and things, or outdated IT equipment that mean it's incredibly slow to boot up your computer and you can't share information easily across services. And so all of those things, which are probably the most likely opportunities for improving the productivity of the staff working in those services, do require some upfront investment to improve the buildings that they're working in, the equipment they're using, all the rest of it.
I think as well it's exacerbated by the quite seesaw nature of spending on public services that we've seen. So we've seen a period of austerity. Then we've seen quite a significant investment that came through in an increased staffing, particularly in the health service. And when you look at some of the research on this, it suggests that, you know, if you flood an institution with a lot of money and a lot of new staff, it's often not best set up to be able to deal with that, not least actually in terms of facilitating the sort of infrastructure requirements that Gemma was discussing. And so now something like the health service finds itself with more staff, but weaker infrastructure, IT infrastructure, but also technical infrastructure and kit. So it's kind of in a really difficult place where, on some measures, it looks like there's been, increasing staffing levels, etc. But actually, in terms of what that can deliver and productivity, is a reflection of this kind of sort of like seesawing investment, which makes it even harder to deliver the productivity gains that we might want to see.
And in the case of the NHS, of course, the absence of a decent social care system, that means that there are people in hospital wards who actually probably shouldn't or don't need to be there, but we've got nowhere else to put them. So there's a whole raft of things. Go on, Jill.
I was going to say, social care is one of the sort of areas where you could say, quite a lot of the sort of, incoherence of government policies coming together. We've had, the no restoration of value of pay settlements, big squeeze on local government spending, which were big source of social care, adult social care spending. You've got the rise in the national living wage, will put a burden on a lot of social care providers. And then you have the sort of panic around the incredibly high migration numbers and the number of people coming in on social care visas, which is one of the huge big growth areas. And this is really an area where there just isn't any sign of coherence. So we've had a bad social care system come to time, but now we seem to have it caught at the fulcrum of a lot of policies that just don't really add up.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful case study of incoherence. Incidentally, just going back to what Gemma says, I would defy anyone to read the IFG's annual performance tracker without resorting to a large glass of Malbec by about page 15, because it really is quite sobering. Well, it's not sobering in that sense, is it? It is quite depressing reading in many ways. I just want to touch on the role of the OBR for a minute, because of course, hidden in the numbers around the autumn statement were some, I'll put it politely, rather implausible forecasts about investments in public services going forward. I don't envy the OBR, because they have to look at these things and keep a straight face to an extent. I mean, could and should the OBR be a little bit more strident in coming out and saying, hang on a sec, in the real world, this isn't going to happen, is it? Or is their job just an impossible one?
I think they do have a very difficult job, and there is a very unfortunate asymmetry between tax and spending. So the OBR essentially has to take as given what the government says policy is. And on tax, policy is whatever is actually legislated for. And so the government can't just say, oh, we're definitely going to raise income tax by 5p in 3 years' time, and you have to factor that in. The OBR doesn't factor it in until it's actually been legislated. Whereas on the spending side, essentially the government can, particularly beyond the spending review period, so at least during the current spending review, the government has to spell out line by line exactly how much each department is going to get. But beyond that point, the OBR is essentially required to just score whatever the government says is going to be the total level of public spending. I think they've been gradually trying over time to be more and more, to point out more and more skeptically their feelings about those numbers. So this time they had a box going through, well, if you really believe this total spending number, and then you take account of the pledges that have already been made on the NHS workforce and on defence and aid and school spending, that leaves the rest of public spending facing a big real terms cut. And sort of that's as far as they felt able to go. In the past, they used to assume that government would actually underspend its plans, because in practice, that had often been the case, that once government had set budgets, they tended to underspend. The OBR has now taken out all of those underspend assumptions for the later years of the forecasts, essentially feeling that's as far as they can go in saying that that total envelope is probably not going to be met. But I think they do find it very hard to go further than that. It's difficult to know. I mean, I think you could have an alternative. I guess the more extreme alternative assumption would be to spell out, let's assume that recent rate of growth in each department continues into the future, for example, and would that be a more credible baseline rather than just the made up total spending envelope that the government has? But I think it is a very difficult one for the OBR. Because you get into very political territory of questioning what the government's saying. And then at the moment, we're relying much more on independent organisations like the IFG, IFS and others to point out the incredibility of these assumptions. But yeah, it does create a really unhelpful dynamic within fiscal decision making, because it's a lot easier to pencil in nonsense spending numbers than it is to do anything on the tax side.
I do think Richard Hughes is raising his eyebrows more at some of the assumptions that he's being asked to incorporate than Robert Choate ever did, because there is some stuff, which helpfully points out how much money governments tended to shovel into public services, on an annual basis to make the numbers add up when they prove unrealistic, and how much higher they, what they would do to the fiscal headroom. And there is one area now where, at the invitation of the Treasury Select Committee, they do point out that even though the government has legislated for the fuel duty cut to be restored, that it's highly unlikely that they'll do it based on past revealed preference. And they do then say that, that's a big risk, obviously, to the future forecast. So I do think they're getting there. And it's possible that at the hearings next week, when everybody goes and gives evidence to the Treasury Select Committee, that maybe, given what's happened to spending this time, that the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, who hopefully might be watching, might take the opportunity to think about, actually, is there a way in which she could expose more plausibility, or put in some things about public spending when the government seems to have made decisions that very few people think are going to hold longer term. Because I think it's with that sort of license, because, and it'd be very, very interesting to see. Rachel Reeves has promised to strengthen the OBR through her new legislation to do what she calls a fiscal lock, so that the OBR gets to choose whether a fiscal event needs a forecast, not the government, following on from the Liz Truss experience last year. This is another area where she could give them more discretion to question some of the government's assumptions, rather than just tell them that they've got to be guided by government policy, which is the current setup in the Charter of Budget Responsibility.
Part of the issue is with the OBR, Anand, is that at a time of relatively high inflation, a decision not to do something by the government has very big implications. Obviously, we see that in fiscal drag, and you see that with the implied spending limits that they send to the OBR. It creates these implausible, as many have said, cuts to public services. So I think I agree with Jill and Gemma about the fact that the OBR is becoming more vocal at spelling these things out. I think they could perhaps be a little bit more vocal in sort of saying, when the government sends us these resource department expenditure limits totals, that is a decision about how much is available. It's not just a sort of thing that just gradually, it's not just a passive thing. It's actually more of an active thing. The same with the choosing to maintain a freeze when in thresholds when inflation is projected and is coming in much higher. That is an active thing, because these are things which don't show up in the scorecard, which traditionally people would look for and say, what have they done and what are they planning to do in the Red Book or the Autumn Statement scorecard. But now we need the OBR to really, as I think they are doing, but maybe a little bit more to sort of spell out, this is government policy, these are the implications of it. And I think some have pointed out that it might be reasonable for the OBR to do some different scenarios as well. And of, you know, what if they weren't able to cut non-protected departments by 2.5%? What would that mean for the fiscal rules, which of course is what it's really supposed to analyse? So a few more scenarios, a few more red underlinings on what government policy effectively is, even if it's not explicitly said to be government policy, might be good from the OBR. Interesting.
My key takeaway from what Gemma said is that the probable envelope won't be met is economists for we don't believe you. It's very nicely, but there's a fantastic question from Anonymous, and I have no way of knowing if this is the same Anonymous who praised my jumper or not, but anyway. And the question is, who benefits most from the autumn statement?
I mean, of the big tax giveaways, well, the two big tax giveaways were the full expensing for businesses. So businesses who invest a lot in plant and machinery, notably not businesses who invest in other types of assets or human capital and that sort of thing that don't qualify for this full expensing policy, are one of the big beneficiaries of this. The others are people who are working and earning enough to benefit from the national insurance cut, I would say. And we touched a bit on the politics. I think one thing that's sort of interesting in the choice of those tax cuts is if you were purely going for vote-winning things, a lot of money is being given away through particularly the full expensing policy that's not obviously a kind of doorstep vote winner. So it's perhaps not quite as sort of poll boosting as some tax cuts you could have gone for this week.
Yeah, okay, interesting. We've got to mention this. I mean, the OBR is sticking by its assumptions about Brexit and trade, which presumably means the OBR is sticking by its assumptions about Brexit and GDP. We have a situation where both the big parties are talking about nothing but growth when it comes to the economy, and yet we have this thing. I mean, I'm not even sure there's a question here, but it's quite weird, isn't it, that OBR reports keep having this thing in there that is a drag on growth, and yet no one is talking about it. Or is it just me that thinks that's strange?
I think it's you that thinks it's strange, Anand. I just had to say that because it's irresistible. I think it's very interesting what you regard as part of the woodwork. I was talking to a bunch of Canadian civil servants last week who were all going, aren't you nuts to have inflicted the damage on your economy of Brexit? And I said, well, you know, how many of you would vote for union with the US if you thought it would lead to a 4% rise in GDP? And not a single hand went up. So I think it really depends on what you really think is in the available set of politically feasible options. You know, what might they talk about? Well, maybe, you know, we want the OBR to cost the possible benefits of an SPS agreement, you know, which you might come in. But, you know, if you're talking about the sorts of things you can negotiate when you're ruling out membership of the single market and the customs union, which would be a very big move both for the UK and for the EU, which, you know, Netherlands elections, Hungary, you know, Ukraine membership has a hell of a lot of other issues before it wants to start readmittance negotiations with a still deeply conflicted UK. I mean, you know, what would you really usefully say about that in this forecast? And I think the OBR would risk getting into too much sort of speculative politics there. If you had a government that wanted to ask them to assume that we would have a much, much closer relationship and could articulate what that looked like and how that might remove frictions and open up opportunities. But you've seen, I mean, Michel Barnier gave an interview to the FT earlier in the week where he seems now to be being slightly outflanked by the French government or undercut by the French government, where he said, well, of course, the TCA is the TCA. You can't change anything really in it, even when there's very clear and explicit provision that you can change things within the whole set of committees that was set up under it. That was on the rules of origin for electric vehicles. So I'm not sure there's anything much useful that's in the sort of set of things that are going to materialize in the forecast timescale, which is only 5 years, that you could put in it. But I'm prepared to have others disagree with me there. So, and I think, the government's focus now is on how do we grow, given the current set of trading arrangements that we have, including the TCA, rather than putting that back in as speculation.
And I think it's fair to say, I mean, shake your head if you disagree. We've got a question here about whether Labour aligning with the EU in certain areas would improve growth. Very little. I mean, outside of the real growth thing is the single market, isn't it? We might have an SBS agreement might make life easier for agricultural products importers or exporters, and it might help deal with Northern Ireland. But in terms of overall growth, it's relatively trivial, isn't it?
It does remind me a bit, Anand, of that Meatloaf song when they're talking about growth. They say they'll do anything for growth, Labour and the Tories, but they won't do that. They won't talk about reversing Brexit. But I mean, I haven't really got much to add to what Jill says. It's the politics, it seems to me, is the issue. I think the economics is pretty clear cut, but there doesn't seem to be much appetite on either side to go back into that issue. And we've debated on this forum, haven't we, many times, the issue about the slowing impact of that decision to leave the single market and customs union on UK's potential growth, and that hasn't really changed. And that's the OBR, I think, was simply reflecting the consensus when it made that, as you said, that point in its report this week.
Okay, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, the politics of this, and we've got about just under 10 minutes left. I want to touch on this. I mean, there's a lot of questions along the lines of, have the Conservatives set a very effective trap for the Labour Party with this autumn statement? There's one question saying, has this been a hospital pass for Labour? And before we started, I was talking to you about that Robert Shrimsley column in the FT, where he said, it's like Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves have walked into a pub and Jeremy Hunt shouts out, "The drinks are on her." Was it that politically clever, do you think?
So in terms of the sort of trap for Labour, I do think that the big problem in the current set of plans is the spending numbers beyond the next election, which we've said look very implausible. And so whoever wins the next election ends up as Chancellor faces a big problem at that point about how to deal with that, either raise taxes to pay for services people are expecting, or figure out a way to scale back the scope of what the state says. I suspect that we go into the election with both of the main parties signing up to that set of spending numbers and not really dealing with the reality of what that means. I think the danger there is this there's a democratic deficit that the electorate are not really told what they're voting for from either of the main parties, because they may not want to be honest about what those numbers translate into in terms of the type of services. So I think that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of the politics or the political risks in this week's announcements that struck me, was that Jeremy Hunt gave away essentially all the sort of improvement in the fiscal numbers through the tax cuts this week. And so the thing that really was stuck in my mind was, unless you go to the polls before March, you're going to have to do a budget in March. And there's every chance that the numbers could move against him the next time. And as Jill already said, at the moment, the numbers assume that you do a 6p rise in fuel duty next April. We haven't seen a rise in fuel duty since 2010. It doesn't seem like this government would want to do a huge rise in fuel duty immediately before an election. So already Jeremy Hunt will be hoping to find £4 billion of extra room for manoeuvre to cancel that fuel duty rise, plus possibly wanting to do more in terms of tax giveaways immediately before an election. So it seems to me quite a big, as well as being an economic gamble by giving away all your headroom and leaving yourself very little room for manoeuvre, it seems a bit of a political gamble that you're really hoping things get better again between now and March, so that you're not left scrabbling around trying to fill a hole in March immediately before an election.
And presumably it's also the case that with the conflict in the Middle East, the prospect of OPEC doing something or oil prices going up is, it's not something that we can discount, is it?
Yes, I mean, the size of economic revision that would be needed to wipe out the headroom he currently has is not particularly big. You would need a relatively small move in interest rates or oil prices, or small downgrade in the economic outlook could all easily put you in a very tricky position in the March budget.
I think I was press secretary at the Treasury when at the sort of fag end of the Conservative government in the 1990s, when we did a November budget where Ken Clarke cut taxes and things like that. The entire budget leaked. We didn't do it ourselves in those days. We left that to the opposition, who got hold of it, which was all very annoying. But that didn't move the dial significantly. Because one of the real problems, I think, for the government is whatever it does, ultimately people are answering the sort of question, do I trust this set of politicians to run the economy, or do I trust the other set of politicians more and want them to be making the choices rather than, I think, some of the specific things? I thought what was interesting about the politics of this budget, though, as Gemma was saying, is where he chose to spend. I mean, he needn't have done the full expensing, though it did look a very odd cliff edge in the numbers, and everybody was saying this is a very odd tax policy. That was actually, a sort of, what you might call a long-term decision for a brighter future, I suppose, almost. But anyway, so I thought that was actually quite a sensible move. But it was quite interesting because I thought the measures they were briefing out in advance, inheritance tax, stamp duty, well, what I was dubbing a save Surrey strategy, Jeremy, because they were very directed at better off people in expensive houses in the southeast and London. One or two areas I know that's too much of a generalization, but a very focused blue wally strategy. And he did go for something with much wider impacts than that by choosing to do the Nix one and by putting up benefits. So I thought that was quite an interesting move, but I'm not sure there's anything much that Jeremy Hunt or Rishi Sunak can really do either here or in the upcoming budget, if they do have to have one, that will really make a massive political difference to where they are now. And that's really quite a big problem for them, because I think once your reputation for economic competence goes, as it did for the Major government in 1992, however sensible the measures are you put in subsequently, takes an awful long time for that reputation to come back.
And there is Anand of whether it's an effective trap or not. It seems to me, well, that would be an effective trap if Labour was unable to resist sort of saying we will vote against these tax cuts and we are pledging to put back the money that you're implied will be taken out. But I think the discipline is such that they won't fall into that trap and they're able to resist that trap. So in that sense, it's probably not that effective. And if they change the conversation to, are you worse off than you were 4 years ago or 13 years ago, they can just have a different conversation than the wedge issue that the Conservatives would like to have. I agree with Gemma that this does create problems if they stick to Tory spending plans and then we have an election and then they're not realistic and people haven't been warned. But presumably at that stage, the politics turns to saying we were delivered a much worse inheritance. The books are so much worse. We have no choice but to take, emergency action. So they'll try and get out of to deal with the politics of that way.
Yeah, and Jill's economic credibility point, I think, is absolutely key, because there's some evidence that suggests that it's not even in your hands, that, you lose your reputation for economic credibility in 92. When do you get it back? In 2008, when the other lot are screwed up. And in a very, very similar way, you see the two graphs in terms of who do you trust crossing around the time of the mini budget. And, history would suggest that actually there's very little the Conservatives can do to get that back until Labour have disappointed people on the economy. But we'll have to wait and see. So have you all come out of the autumn statement more convinced than you previously were that we're going to have a May election?
Personally, no. I think it's very likely that they'll go long, because I don't think the opinion polls are likely to change. And why would you vote for an early election if you meant you were leaving down the street earlier than you otherwise might? I think it's a simple incentive will operate in that term.
I mean, Jill and I are clinging to that January 25 date from the office sweepstake, aren't we, Jill?
Yes, though I do think he's trying to give himself an option of going earlier if something happened that suddenly made it look sort of sensible by having done got a bit of that good news out there. So, and as I was saying, they might feel the need to go to avoid having to do their very, very difficult March budget. So, but I still think it's incredibly difficult to give up power before you have to, if you look as though you're on the way out.
I would agree with that. It feels more like keeping options open. I tend to think they probably stay as long as possible. And for me, the difficult crunch point is March. So going in May isn't early enough to avoid that moment.
I'm also in the going long camp. I can't see a strong reason why they would go early.
Superb. We end on a note of consensus. And oh my God, I've timed this brilliantly. Aren't I good at this? Listen, thank you so much, the four. Like I said to you before we started, I really like these events because actually I come out of it with the sort of misleading view that I understand economics a bit more than when I started, but you've all been fantastically clear and concise as ever. Thanks to all of you for logging in. Thanks particularly to Anonymous for the jumper comments, which I really appreciate. For those who are interested in the public opinion issue, we've got a big conference on the 5th of December where it's a who's who of academics working on public opinion coming to tell you where we're at in the United Kingdom at the moment. For the moment, thank you. Have a really good weekend when it comes, and we'll